This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with my New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. Well, here we are in the first week of January in 2021, and I was pursuing some of the articles. I've written hundreds of articles over the year and looking for a subject for today. And what hit me was an article I wrote a couple of decades ago or more called New Hampshire's 7 Sleepers. So it's about how some animals survive the winters right here in New Hampshire by sleeping much of the winter away. In fact, most of the winter away for many of these animals. Something I think this year with a pandemic and with a situation that we'd all like to do. But so let me name and tell a little bit about the 7 New Hampshire sleepers. Well, some are true hibernators. They actually go to bed in the fall or go to sleep in the fall, and they don't wake up till the spring. So they are dormant all winter long and move very little. They don't feed, they don't drink anything, they don't eat anything, they don't defecate or urinate. They just are in for the winter, and they don't move very much at all. So the first one I want to talk about is bats. Now, back in the 80s, Fishing Game was interested in, the non-game folks, in tallying our wintering bats here. And I'd run into bats before in buildings over the wintertime, usually big brown bats in a few buildings, because for 25 years, not only did I work full-time as a wildlife biologist for the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, but beginning in February of 1983, I began operating a business called Bat and Wildlife Control Specialist. So I focused most on bats because bats is what I really wanted to save, but I caught a few other nuisance animals, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So I've had an interest in bats my whole life. I learned early on that you could kind of interact with bats. If you throw a rock up at dusk in the summertime, they'll kind of chase it down. So bats have always intrigued me. So I volunteered to help out the folks get into some winter dens in New Hampshire, which happen to be old mines. They are, you could call them caves, but they wouldn't be there if they weren't built as mines back in, I guess, the 1800s and maybe early 1900s. So there's a scattering of maybe 4 or 5 or a half dozen mines across New Hampshire that have some wintering bats. So I went in with other staff from Fish and Game, and I think someone from Mass Fish and Game that was more familiar with wintering bats. So we went into several mines in New Hampshire, and we found a few hundred bats, and now that number is vastly diminished because of the white nose syndrome. So, but at the time, in the 80s into the 90s, we did have some numbers of bats, a few hundreds, in some of these winter mines, these old mines. I think they were lead mines primarily. So let's talk about bats. In the summertime, their heart rate is about 210 beats per minute. In the wintertime, it's down to 8. Just barely alive. 8 beats in a minute. And their body temperature goes from 100 degrees down to basically ambient, about 40 degrees. So in most of these mines that we went into, we did check the temperature. They'd be in the high 30s. So that's about where the bat's temperature is. They're at the ambient temperature of the earth, where below the frost line. So bats were one of the ones. The second true hibernator is our woodchucks. Now, woodchucks go into den usually into a burrow in late fall and don't come out till April or so. Now, a woodchuck's heartbeat is usually around 105 beats per minute. But there again, like bats. In the wintertime, 5 beats per minute. So a fraction, several seconds before even a heartbeat. So just barely alive, just enough to survive the winter. And their breaths go from 40 breaths a minute to maybe 1 a minute, and or to 8 to 10 a minute here, I guess I have. So woodchucks. Another true hibernator, and I've only run across one of these in my career, my 50-year career here in New Hampshire as a wildlife biologist. And for decades, for 30 years, part of my job for the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department was to check duck nesting boxes. There's about 300, I think, that Fish and Game has scattered across the state. Well, lucky me, I got to go to check the duck boxes at Little Cohas Marsh and Londonderry, right where I grew up and discovered the duck boxes when I was 12 years old and began building and checking my own. So decades worth of checking duck boxes in the winter, and you can determine what duck nested there and how many and whether they were successful, and you put in fresh savings. Well, when I opened up this box, I remember distinctly it was on February 2nd, Groundhog Day. So Groundhog Day in 1980 something or early 90s, I pull this duck box open at Little Cohas Marsh, and out comes a meadow mouse. They're a little small mouse. They have a big long tail and great big feet, and they hop like a kangaroo. They are jumping mice. They hop, and I read that they can hop, I think, as far as 8 or 10 feet at a time. Quite a bit. Well, this mouse wasn't hopping. He was in true hibernation, curled up in a ball, just like that. Curled right up in a ball, did not move. I mean, he was in like this grassy nest with mostly grass, I recall. I don't think I had a camera that day, so I never got a picture, but he was just balled up in this little cocoon of grass that he'd made to spend the winter in that duck nesting box. So jumping mice, like the woodchucks, their heart rate is over 300 beats per minute, 350. No, let's see, where am I? I guess I don't have beats per minute for the jumping mice, but their temperature goes from about 98.6 down to about 36 degrees in the wintertime, and they lose about 35% of their body weight. Number 4 I have here on my list of what are true hibernators, and I didn't really know that before and didn't remember what our chipmunks are kind of true hibernators as well. Now, chipmunks, they do stir every few days or every week or so to feed and defecate, so they are somewhat a restless hibernator, but they are a true hibernator. And if you've ever watched the chipmunks in the fall, they are storing a lot of your black oil seed, sunflower seeds. They just haul away tons of seeds or acorns or whatever they can find, and they dig a big burrow, and they build storerooms, kind of, like closets for their food, and they put away food for the winter, and they do feed all winter, even though much of the time they are hibernating, which means that their heart rate goes from over 300 beats per minute down to about only 4 per minute. So again, barely alive as they slumber in the ground. And another thing these animals do is in the fall, they gather what's called brown fat, very dense fat that helps them to awaken quicker and bring their brains back into function. Couldn't we all use that some mornings when we get up? So some brown fat. So a lot of these animals store a special kind of fat that helps them survive these lean times over the winter and keep their core body functions in operation. So some of the other sleepers. So that's 4 of the true hibernators. Now, other animals that are not necessarily true hibernators are black bears. I was a bear biologist in New Hampshire beginning in 1978, and I've been into a number of bear dens over the winter. They're generally a brush pile, a blowdown, an upturned tree where the bear has this den here, rock pile. A couple of times there were excavated dens into the soil. Not all that often. Big boulder fields or logging operations where they've pushed up some of the logs that they can't use. I've found bear dens in some of those in the past. These would be from radio-collared bears that we could actually track and find them in the winter in their den. So it wasn't something that you're just going to go out and find some denning bears. You generally have to have a radio collar on them to find them in the wintertime. But bears too, their temperature drops from like 100 down to 88. Now, when you walk around that den, the bear is watching you. They got an eye right on you. If you were to poke a stick in there, they would bite it, and or any extremity that you might offer, they will bite. So, and occasionally the bears will bolt out of the den. So they are lethargic. In fact, there was a name for it. It's called carnivorous lethargy. Carnivorous lethargy. So they aren't true hibernators. They're just lethargic, as many of us are this winter. I find myself being that some days. So black bears. So they might lose 40% of their weight. And one thing about bears very interesting is in the summertime when they're just kind of hanging out, it's hot, their heartbeat might only be around 64 or 65 beats per minute. But in the fall, when they're hustling to find food, sometimes they might eat 10,000 calories a day to put on a thick layer of fat to survive the winter when they're in hibernation. So in the fall, their heart rate goes up. In the wintertime, way down to about 40 beats per minute. So way down. They're slumbering, they're sleeping, they're lethargic, but they're not hibernating. And in fact, this time of year, in another week or two, our female black bears will be having their cubs, usually in late January, mid to late January. They have 2 to 3 cubs. The older females, older than age 3 or 4 or 5, will typically have 3 cubs, and the females, when they turn 3 and have their first litter, only have 2 cubs or 1. So our older females typically produce more cubs, but bears actually breed midsummer in June, and those fertilized eggs float in the uterus and they don't attach till they den up in the fall, in November. And with bears, it's been found, if they don't have that thick layer of fat enough to nourish them and their would-be cubs over the winter, they simply abandon those eggs. They do not attach. They do not grow. So, and I'm thinking this winter, because we had the drought last year, near record bear kill at just under 1,200, that the bears went into the den very hungry, very lean. So my guess is this winter, I doubt many of the females will be very successful. And of course, bears at best have cubs every other year, because the cubs stay with them for a year and a half before they rebreed at 2nd June. So bears at best breed every other year, and this year a lot of the females will simply not be having cubs. What else is happening? Well, let me look at raccoons. Raccoons, they too are in this torpor. It's called torpor or lethargy. You know, they may lose 50% of the weight. Yes, their heart rate drops somewhat as well. What else do I have here? It goes from 100 beats per minute and sometimes down to 4 or 5 beats per minute. So yeah, they can be logy, torpor, or lethargic. And skunks. So when I think of skunks, I think of, you know, and they are communal denners. So skunks like to hang out together for the winter. And I read an article recently that when they did some research of skunks, they found that over half of the wintering skunk dens were under human structure. So they like to get into sheds or under a breezeway or under a porch. And reminds me back in the 80s when I was still working in Concord, I had a call from a legislator who could smell skunks at her house and asked me if I could come catch them. Now I did mostly bats, but now and then I'd do a skunk or squirrels or something like that, or raccoons, not too often. But I took this challenge on. It was late spring or early spring, I guess. And I actually built a fence. I could see where the skunks were coming out from under the porch, and I put up a wire fence so no other skunks could come and get in there, but any that were under the porch I could catch in my live trap. And over the next week and a half or 2 weeks, I caught 21 skunks from under her porch. 21, yes. They do den communally. Usually only females den together, and sometimes the males, but typically they den by separate sexes. So 21 skunks under that porch that year. So yes, and so skunks, their temperature drops from about 99 down to 79, so they cool down for the winter. And I even learned recently that gray squirrels can go lethargic for a few days. So they're not denner, they don't den like these other animals for weeks on end, but they can go into a slumber for a few days. And I just remember when we had a lot of snow mid-December, had that 2 feet of snow here, fluffy snow. I had no squirrels for a couple days. So what were they doing? They were being lethargic. They were just hunkered down, and you know, it would take more energy to get through that deep fluffy snow to find food than it would be worth getting the food. So when the going gets tough, they rest. They don't go anywhere. They just don't eat for a few days just to survive, because it's the best thing to do for them is to not try to find food and waste a lot of energy. Hang in there for a few days till the weather breaks or conditions are better, and I can go find some food and not waste energy looking for food. So even gray squirrels can be lethargic for a few days. So not a true hibernator or even a true sleeper, because it only needs a few days. And I just learned recently that out in Colorado there is a bird that hibernates. It's called the gray and white whippoorwill. And they actually in Colorado have found that this whippoorwill hibernates. So we have a hibernating bird, but you'd have to go to Colorado to find it. So yeah, some neat winter adaptations for our animals in New Hampshire and Colorado. And wonderful to learn about our friends who are sound asleep this winter. You know, not to worry. I'm just going to snooze this winter away and wake up next spring when things are different, and I certainly hope they are. Again, wildlife biologist for my New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button.